This is the Everyday Fray podcast, hosted by Michael Howie.
Hello, friends. I'm Michael Howie, and welcome to episode 2 of the Everyday Fray. Last week was the launch of this new podcast, and I've received a wonderful response to that first episode, with kind words, people sharing their own experiences and ideas for interviews. I can't thank you all enough for the support. Please do join me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Everyday Fray Podcast to stay in touch, and check out the new website at everydayfraypodcast.com to see some new blogs, tips on getting the most out of a podcast, and more. Please remember as you listen this week that this podcast and the blogs at everydayfraypodcast.com are not replacements for treatment or the advice of a medical professional. The podcast community is something special, and if you've not hosted one, it's a bit hard to explain. But from the simple tripod and Podern Family hashtags on Twitter to the Facebook pages and subreddits, there's always someone willing to help out. A good example is the lovely voice you hear at the beginning of each episode of this podcast. That's Cynthia, and she's the wife of Christopher Gonlin from the Not About Lumberjacks, Men in Gorilla Suits, and Hell Comes with Panel Doors podcasts. Without really knowing me beyond my occasional posts in a Facebook group and my work on the Defender Radio podcast, Christopher and Cynthia immediately, and with great skill, offered to help me get that intro together when I posted online looking for assistance. That kind of community isn't always easy to find, and it's one for which I'm grateful. And podcasts can be a place of healing, too. Take, for instance, the Grass Gets Greener podcast. Host Melissa Wilson survived bullying in middle school. Her path to healing took her many years, and along the way she decided to write and then podcast about the experience. With the podcast, Melissa has found both healing for herself and the opportunity to help others heal through interviews with survivors of various traumas. And with more than 100 episodes in the vault, it's an inspiring tale of awareness, acceptance, and finding out that the grass really can get greener. Melissa joined the Everyday Fray to share her journey, how the Grass Gets Greener podcast has helped her move forward, and what it's meant to host and hear the stories of so many other survivors. The place that makes sense for me to start with you is your podcast. Could you explain a bit about what your podcast is and maybe what you like to cover through it?
Sure. So my podcast is called The Grass Gets Greener. And I've been doing it since October 2014. And basically, I speak with survivors of childhood traumas who are, doing pretty well today. And they come on and they share their story of what they experienced growing up and, how it affected them and the things that they've been able to do to get to where they are today. And, I like to do that to provide hope and inspiration for those listening who are, maybe still struggling with whatever they experienced growing up, and maybe they're feeling a little bit alone and hopeless. And I like to just be able to share these stories of these survivors who've been there and, have now gotten to a better place, just to let these listeners know that, that's totally possible for them as well.
It is always interesting to hear different perspectives too, when you sort of have a common issue perhaps of how one person perceived their experience or how, they manage with a certain coping strategy. And it's, reading about your podcast on your website, this is something that's personal to you. You have come from a place of trauma in your history. I think before we start into that, I have one important question is what do you consider to be trauma? Because this is a subject where I think there might be, a technical terminology for it, as well as the sort of maybe more colloquial usage of the term. Mm-hmm. So how do you view it?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I don't have a textbook definition for mm-hmm. you right in front of me, but how I view it is, something that has affected you negatively in some way and is now, is now negatively impacting your life as you're trying to move forward and trying to create something with your life. So it's really, I think, just something that's happened to you that is outside of your control and is now having a negative effect on you, and you're struggling to navigate your way through it to get past it.
I think that's a really, really good overview, actually. And again, we don't want to get bogged down in those technical terms, which I found, through my life, people tend to focus on rather than trying to find healing or coping strategies to get past whatever the trauma may be. And I think that, does definitely lead us into your journey. It's something that you've talked a bit about on your podcast. You talk a little bit about on your website. Could you share with us, what your story is, to the extent with which you're comfortable, of course?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, my background is mainly childhood bullying. I did have some emotional and physical abuse in there as well, growing up at home. But the big thing for me was being bullied when I was in junior high school. And so I was bullied, pretty much every day for 2 years in 7th and 8th grades. And yeah, it really had a lasting effect on me because I think when you go through something every day for that amount of time, and of course some people go through that sort of thing for even longer, but when you go through that, it really just changes the way that you see yourself. And especially, at that age, I mean, you're trying to figure out who you are anyways. You're not sure how you see yourself, right? And so when you have people who are saying things about you and doing things to you and making you feel a certain way, making you feel less than and like there's something wrong with you, it's going to shape you going forward. And for me, when I got out of that situation, I just felt completely alone and scared and confused, and just didn't really know who I was. And it took me a while to start figuring that out, to get to that place where I was starting to figure that out. And it took me a while to even speak about what had happened to me. I think I didn't tell someone about what had happened for like 5 years afterwards, so I went through it all on my own and just internalized everything, kept it all to myself, and that, kind of made matters even worse. But there was just so much shame around it. I felt like because this had happened to me, I must have done something to deserve it. I must, there must be something wrong with me, like those who are bullying me are trying to convince me of. Mm-hmm. And so why would I want to, tell someone that this was happening? Because I just felt like that's just going to, reaffirm how I feel about myself and make me feel like there is something wrong with me. And I thought they would just put the blame on me and say, well, why did you do the things to make them want to bully you, or you know what I mean? And so for me, it was not just, being bullied for those 2 years, but it was also just keeping it to myself and not getting the help that I really needed. And that made things even worse for me in the end.
It's amazing how significantly it can impact you in that way. And I think, speaking from the perspective of, and I'm, full disclosure, the white male affluent community growing up, no bullying, no trauma. You hear bullying and you hear it in pop culture and you kind of think, yeah, well, everyone gets bullied a bit. And everyone gets teased, and there's bullies at work, and there's people that you're going to meet, at a party that you don't like who are going to try and give you a hard time. But bullying that we talk about these days and that you're talking about really it's almost a systemic treatment of an individual, isn't it? It's not just a one-time, hey, I think you're wearing a dumb hat, or pushing someone around in the hallway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what kind of, differentiates it from maybe just, um, some quote unquote innocent teasing to really um, to being something that is more severe than that, something that deeply affects people and, even in extreme cases, leads them to want to take their life because of it.
Again, it is something that really does sort of, I think, affect how you see yourself. And that's kind of what I get from you, is that you feel that you're being treated this way for a reason that is your fault. And, I volunteer with the Big Brothers program. And one of the things they tell us is whenever bullying comes up, the absolute first thing to explain is it's never their fault. And it took me a while to figure out why they say that and why that's such a strong part of their messaging. But I think, your story is very revealing of that, that being able to talk about it openly comes from a place of knowing that it's maybe not my fault. What happened once you were able to start talking about it?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, the first person I told was my mother, and I didn't quite get the reaction I was looking for. I was looking for support. And I got more of like, well, why did you wait so long to tell me? I wish you had told me sooner so I could have done something about it back then. So then after that, I kind of retreated a little bit again and was, kind of hesitant to talk about it with people. So I think it wasn't until I eventually got into therapy and started to talk about it in there a little bit that I started to understand that, yeah, it wasn't my fault. And there's not really, anything wrong with me. It wasn't anything I did to make this happen, or to cause them to want to bully me. So that was, helpful for me. That was kind of like probably the first time that I really started to look at it that way and not see it as something that, was my fault, something that I had done. And I think, unfortunately, that's probably a common experience for a lot of people who've been bullied. They do feel like it's their fault. They do feel like whatever it is they're being made fun of for, maybe it's something about their appearance or something about, the way they speak or the way they act, that, it's their fault. If only they weren't that way, then this wouldn't happen to them. But that's not true. I think that those who want to bully you are going to find something to bully you for, regardless. So there's not really anything that you can do to, to prevent them from doing that to you in regard to, who you are and how you're portraying yourself. Like if they're going to want to bully you, they're going to find something to bully you for.
Well, and I think something that's curious, at the very least, is in pop culture very frequently, we see bullying as the schoolyard bully and the boy standing up to him. It's kind of a David and Goliath thematic look at it. But women and girls experience bullying, I think, maybe in a different way, or at least it's not talked about as much. I'm coming at this without knowledge of the subject and just sort of like what I have seen, as well as my own experience. And talking with the women in my life and hearing the stories of what the bullying is like, it almost seems, like psychological more than, when I was a kid being bullied, you're chubby, you're weird, your hair is funny, pushed around, and sort of, it just sort of comes and goes. It was never, as I said, that systemic thing. Do you think women and girls experience bullying differently than men, or than other people, sort of in general?
I think so. Yeah, I think, if you're not, one of the popular girls, you're not, in that group, part of that clique, you're definitely going to get treated differently. You're going to be ostracized. And I think, in some cases, like, I mean, they're going to kind of gang up on you and try to, find things to bully you for. And, it can definitely get, aggressive and really just downright cruel, and you're going to have them probably, spreading rumors about you or trying to get you, into situations where you end up, looking like an idiot for something, and just to really to wear you down, and just kind of there's I think that mob mentality,
Hmm.
and so that makes it a really challenging situation for a girl to be in. And I did have that kind of happen to me to some extent. I mean, for me, it was, literally like every single other student in my class, was part of the bullying in some fashion or another. But, sometimes you might even, like, when you're a girl, you might be friends with another girl. And then if she finds out that you're getting bullied and, she determines, well, okay, it's no longer cool to hang out with you anymore, to be your friend. So then she'll end up turning on you and becoming, one of your enemies. And you're just like, well, what happened? I thought you were my friend.
Hmm.
And so I think, yeah, there's a lot of that going on for girls in school.
Well, and there's certainly a spectrum too as we look at issues for individuals who are minorities or who are part of the LGBT spectrum. So there's it's as much as I'm asking you very specific questions, I think we do need to acknowledge that it is a very diverse subject with many different people who have experienced it in many different ways. And I'm curious, do you think that the people who bullied you at that age remember it the way you remember it, or look back at it and think, I was a jerk? Or do you think maybe to them it was just part of life and they've moved on? Or can you
Yeah.
say?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've wondered that myself at times, but I honestly don't know, and I haven't been in contact with any of them. So yeah, I can't say. Um,
Well, and I suppose it's not necessarily a healthy conversation to have, is to speculate. Yeah.
no, right. I mean, it doesn't. I suppose it doesn't matter at this point to me. But yeah, I honestly I have no idea. I mean, maybe maybe they remember, but it doesn't seem as severe to them, or they don't remember at all. I don't know, but yeah, it doesn't matter. I mean, for me, I focus on um, just living my life today, and kind of not looking back in that regard.
Yeah. Being present, I think, is the term that we all learn in various types of therapy. And speaking of that, you say it was several years after the bullying had really sort of taken place and come to more or less an end, I suppose. And what happened, do you think, or what was your experience once you had started that therapy? I mean, and this is very interesting to me. I myself never fully completed a therapy program dealing with my anxiety disorder, and I'm actually about to start a new one and try and see it through all the way. For you, was it a all of a sudden realization of some of these things that you said, that it wasn't your fault, that your value is not based on what these cruel kids said to you? Or was it maybe the beginning of a very long conversation for you?
Yeah, I think it was a very gradual process. I didn't have all these realizations all at once. But going to therapy allowed me to start having that conversation and just start opening myself up to these possibilities. And it was just over time. I mean, I went to therapy for many years, and I think it was, being in a safe environment where I could talk about this sort of stuff and know that, I'm not going to be judged for it, allowed me to just really get into the issues and explore them and come to, understand all of the things that I was feeling and why I was feeling those ways, and what what it all meant. And I think that over time, after being in therapy for many years, I can look back on it after it's all said and done and see how I've come to understand how this all kind of played out for me, and looking back on it now, I think it's one of those things too, where maybe, while you're in therapy, you're not even, you don't have that sort of, 10,000 foot view of the whole situation. And it's, maybe afterwards and you realize the things that you were able to work on and what you were able to get out of that. And maybe some things that you still have to work on going forward,
Yeah, and it's I'm sitting here and I'm looking at the rain and listening to our conversation and realizing it's all very dire. But that isn't life. You've experienced trauma, but reading sort of what you've done since then, you've gone to school, you've been in the field of research. You've also not like your life did not get defined solely by that experience. And you have been able to start helping people in a variety of ways. Do you think that your life was defined by that, or do you think that it was an experience and you are now more of a whole person with the, again, we're talking about a very heavy subject. But is there a lot more about your life now?
Yeah, absolutely. What I went through, it's certainly part of my story. It's a part of my life. But it's a part of my past, and, of course it's still, I think, plays out now in the present, in certain ways, but I hope that it's more in a positive way than in a negative one, and in the ways that I'm using it to, like you said, to now help others and to do what I'm doing today. I think, I like to say that, traumatic experiences, I mean, they definitely, shape us, but they don't have to break us. And so, for me, it's about what can I take away from what I experienced? Obviously, like, I am who I am today because of what I went through. And of course, I have no idea who I would be today if I hadn't gone through that. But, because I went through it, I want to see what can I take away from it that I can use today to help other people who are going through the same thing, and who are still feeling stuck and maybe, feeling alone and not sure how to move forward.
Well, and that leads nicely into how you started your podcast. I mean, was it sort of an aha moment of this will make me feel better? Was it a moment of maybe I can help other people feel better? Or was it maybe something you kind of just wanted to explore? This sort of relatively new technology and way of sharing ideas and stories.
Yeah, I definitely like the idea of a podcast, and how, you can reach people through that medium. And other than that, I wanted to start it to help other people, to share these stories of others who've been through this stuff as well. Because, for me, it started with my blog, which I'd started about 6 months prior to starting the podcast. And, I started that because I wanted to, I just got into that place in my healing where I wanted to help others, right? I wanted to basically create a resource that I felt like I needed, when I was really feeling alone and not sure how to move forward, and really not sure um, how many other people were, going through what I was going through. And then, I decided to create the podcast because I figured, well, I think it's great that I'm like sharing my story, but what if I share other people's stories as well? I think that can help people to see that they're not alone in what they're going through, and can provide them with even more hope and inspiration than I can just by myself. And so that's when, I decided to create the podcast and bring these other survivors on to have them share their stories as well. And not only that, but, what has allowed them, like I said, to get to where they are today. And hopefully in doing that, it's providing that hope and that inspiration to those listening, and giving them some strategies that they could use for themselves as well.
The experience of starting a new podcast, as I'm doing right now with Everyday Fray, as I've done in the past, and as you've done, as many other people have done, can be very, I don't know about intimidating, but certainly confusing, sort of trying different things. What was it like sort of getting into your groove and starting to do your interviews in what is a very sensitive, at the very least, subject?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I was, I'd say, a little terrified at first, and a little unsure what I was doing. But I had this idea of how I wanted to do this show, and just to share these stories. And so I just got into it, reached out to people. And I think I started out reaching out to some people who I knew already. So that made it a little bit easier. But yeah, I mean, it was definitely something outside of my comfort zone at first. And it was weird to just kind of, sit behind a microphone and have these conversations with people about such dark and delicate topics. And I wanted to make sure that I was doing it justice. And I think it was made a little bit easier, I would say, by the fact that I had gone through stuff in my past, so I felt like, okay, well, at least I'm talking to them about something that I sort of have this experience with myself, rather than, trying to talk to them about something I know nothing about,
Mm-hmm.
So that definitely helped. But yeah, it was definitely a little weird or uncomfortable at first. And I remember actually the first episode I did was just a solo episode where I was just sharing my story. And that was, challenging. I think it was like the first time that I had kind of spoken about it in that way,
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird when you're just trying to like talk about it and you don't have someone interviewing you. So that was interesting also.
And how did it feel though? Once, I mean, you sat down behind a microphone and more or less sort of just poured your heart and soul out and said, this is who I am. In particular, with that trauma. How did you feel afterwards? Once you had it, you'd said it all. You had gone through the process all of us podcast hosts love of editing and posted online. What was your emotional state?
I think it was mixed, I mean, part of me was like just scared to put it out there. But another part of me was ready to do it and felt excited about it, and what it could lead to. And just kind of this possibility that it could help others. I think I was really driven by that throughout all of this. Just that was my motivation. That was my focus. Like, I'm doing this to help others, and that made it a little bit easier for me. It kind of, when you're doing something, in the service of others, it really kind of, it takes that fear away, I think, and it allows you to do it in spite of how you might be feeling, because you have this kind of bigger purpose for it.
Yeah, that's a very, very good insight. I think it's very true. That's, I like to say doing good for other people feels good. And that in itself is like it's a quasi selfish reason to help other people. But it is true. And, I would imagine it's also very cathartic to be able to put it all out there, and sort of stand back and say, see who I am, and be proud of who you are today as a result of all of these things you've experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. And I felt like once I had done that, now I was free to talk about it. And, because I think up to that point, even though I had been talking about it a little bit and I had written about it on the blog, I still felt like I was holding back a little bit. And once I just got it out there that way, I felt like, I'm free to talk about it. And now, I don't have anything really holding me back in that regard anymore. So that was, that was a really, just a good experience for me in that way.
Yeah, it's kind of neat how the process of talking has been liberating for you in its different forms, both from talking in the therapeutic session to writing to doing your podcast. And now you've got this history of this great series of interviews with people, survivors, authors, practitioners. What do you feel that you get out of the interviews now? And again, it's another selfish question, but it's, I know what I get out of listening to those. And I think most people who experience trauma or really any kind of mental health issues, from you with trauma to me with anxiety to others with a multitude of other issues, it's comforting to know there are others, to hear the experiences, to hear the coping strategies, to hear the successes. But as the person doing the interview, what do you feel that you're taking away from it?
I think for me, being the interviewer, it's about, I think for me, it's also about that feeling of not being alone anymore. I know that that's something that the listeners can take away from it, but I still get that sense as well. It's a reminder for me that, even though I know there are, all these survivors out there in the world who are going through, their challenges and they're on their healing journeys. I know that, like every time I talk to someone, it reminds me that, that I'm not alone. Even if, like, let's say I'm having a bad day and I do one of these interviews, and there's usually something that is said in that interview that is like that I needed to hear as well. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's also just a constant source of inspiration, to hear about how all of these survivors are doing today and all of the good that they're doing. It just continues to inspire me to keep doing what I'm doing as well. So I think those are the things that I take away from it at this point.
Well, it's interesting to me to hear you talk about that, because as you were talking about your past and how the bullying made you question your self-worth, made you question who you are as a person, I actually did same thing you've done, which is sort of tell my story for my first episode, which will be preceding this one. And I was talking about how following my divorce, which in part had to do with my anxiety for my first marriage, it was all of a sudden being free to start exploring maybe who I am more directly rather than who I'd always tried to be or who I told myself I had to be. And when you were explaining the feeling of questioning identity and not knowing that these things aren't your fault, it dawned on me that there was actually bullying in my first marriage. So, I mean, there you go. That's a perfect example of sort of the power of this format and these interviews between survivors and people with mental health and really anyone. Is just all of a sudden hearing your story sort of puts a little light on a part of mine that I hadn't seen before. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you never know what's going to come up when you're talking about this stuff.
Yeah. And I love the title of your show, The Grass Gets Greener. Is this something that maybe you just sort of like you played with, or was it a title that you sort of dawned on you as some of these things do?
I don't honestly, I don't remember exactly like when it came to me. But I remember that originally this was what I was going to title a book that I was gonna write. Basically, just kind of like a memoir. And this was just the title that had come into my head for it. And then I've since not written that book yet. As I've kind of gone down the path of doing the blog and the podcast. And so then I took that title and I ended up using it for what I'm doing now with online work. But, I think for me, it's about the grass getting greener for you, because I think when you're going through these sorts of challenges and you're really not feeling very good about yourself, you tend to look at other people, right? And you think that they have it better than you. And I want to help people see that, the grass can get greener for you. You can create a life for yourself that you feel good about, where you're not going to care about what the other person is doing or how their life looks to you, because you're going to feel really good about what you've created for yourself.
Yeah, and I really like that it is that play on sort of the two aspects, is the grass is always greener on the other side, as well as the concept that it gets better. So you're merging those two concepts. And it's very also empowering, I think, in that when you think about grass getting greener, is it takes some work. It doesn't just sort of get greener, but there is that sort of that work behind it. And as sort of letting go of the past and living for today. And that does take effort.
Mm-hmm. You've got to water it. You've got to tend to it,
Yep. You've got to yell at the dogs peeing on it sometimes, which is what I've been doing for the last few weeks. Although now we're splitting our metaphors. And I think a nice place to end is if you could speak out to the people who may be experiencing bullying, whether it's, in their youth as you did, or maybe people who, as my very recent revelation, experienced in a relationship, or maybe with parents or loved ones, siblings, whomever. What do you want them to know that you have learned through your experiences about bullying and about being able to move forward?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One is that, you are stronger than you realize. And this is something that I think, has become apparent through the interviews I've done on my show. My guests are kind of a testament to that, of being able to go through what they've gone through and to now get onto the other side of that and have, life today that they feel good about. Because, for anyone who is struggling or is really going through a challenging situation, I mean, take a look at, what you've endured, and it takes a strong person to be able to get through that. And if you've gotten, through that, if you've gone through something and now, you're out of it, and maybe, you're not where you want to be just yet in your life, but you're no longer in that situation. I mean, just stop and think about that for a minute and look at, how far you have come. I know maybe it doesn't feel like you've come too far, especially, if you're still really struggling, but just, have some hope for the fact that you've survived it to this point. You've gotten through the worst of it. And if you keep going, it can definitely get better. And, I like to believe that no matter where you're coming from, you can get to where you want to be. It's going to, like we said, I mean, it's going to take doing the work that's necessary to make that happen. And it's going to take some time, but you can get there, and there are small things that you can do each day to make you feel a little bit better about yourself. And then over time, you can start to see some bigger changes taking place. And, like I said, if you're out of that abusive or controlling situation, that means that you're in charge of your life now. And that, I know that can seem scary at first because you're not used to that. You're used to someone kind of being in charge of that for you. And now that you have that freedom, you have that control, it's a little bit scary. You don't know what to do with it. But it, all in all, it's a good thing. And, so take the time to kind of determine what it is that you want and how to make that happen, and do the work to heal your wounds. Because if you don't heal the things that are still affecting you from your past, that are going to keep showing up. But I think, the main overall message is that, you can get to wherever it is that you're trying to get to, and your past does not have to equal your future.
Thanks again to Melissa for sharing her path to a life after bullying and the incredible experiences she's had in growing the Grass Gets Greener podcast. To listen, visit thegrassgetsgreener.com or look up the show on iTunes. You can find links on this week's Everyday Fray podcast blog too. And thank you for joining us this week. I'm Michael Howie for the Everyday Fray podcast, and my journey is far from over.